Somewhere in the British Museum, in a room that smells faintly of old stone and climate-controlled air, there is a small clay tablet. It is not impressive to look at. Cracked at one corner, the colour of dried mud, small enough to hold in 2 hands, but pressed into its surface, in tiny wedge-shaped marks made by a reed stylus more than 4,000 years ago, is a list. A list of cities, a list of kings, and before anything else, before the first name and the first number, a single quiet claim that stops you cold. Kingship descended from heaven. What follows that line is one of the strangest documents in the history of human writing. It names cities that existed, it says, before a great flood erased everything. It gives those cities kings who ruled for lengths of time so enormous they seem more like geological epochs than human lifetimes. And then it says the flood came. And then it says kingship descended from heaven again. And then it continues into history as we know it, into names we can check, into cities we have actually excavated, into ground we have actually dug. That tablet is the Sumerian King List, and the question it raises is one that has quietly occupied scholars, historians, and curious people for well over a century. What did the ancient Sumerians mean when they wrote about a world before the flood? What are these cities? Who are these rulers? And what does it say about the people who wrote this down, that they felt the need to reach backward through catastrophe to find the very first beginning of organized human life? Those are the questions this story will try to sit with. Not answer definitively, because the honest truth is the evidence is complicated and the debates are real, and anyone who tells you they have it all figured out is moving faster than the material allows. The evidence here is textual, it is symbolic, it is layered with interpretation and mythology and scribal tradition, and the goal is not to prove that a lost civilization existed beneath ancient floodwaters, and it is not to dismiss the tablets as pure invention either. The goal is something quieter than that. Careful listening. Following these old words city by city, name by name, down through the flat southern landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, and trying to hear what they were actually trying to say. If you are using this to fall asleep, that is exactly what it was made for. So settle in. Find a comfortable position. Let the light go low if it wants to. Because this is the kind of story that works best slowly, the kind that moves the way rivers move across flat ground, without rushing, without forcing anything, just following the oldest channels it knows. And before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I read those comments, and there is something genuinely extraordinary about them. Someone in Edinburgh at 2 a.m, someone in Sao Paulo just before dawn, someone in a small town in Ohio who cannot explain why ancient Mesopotamia helps them sleep, but here they are. I love that. Leave a comment. Tell me your city and your hour, because in a strange way, that is what this whole story is about. People in places at particular moments in time, trying to make sense of where they are in the long sweep of things. The Sumerians who wrote the King List were doing something not entirely different. They were standing in their own present, looking backward across what felt to them like an almost mythological distance, and trying to trace the thread of civilization back to its very first beginning. They chose 5 cities. They chose 8 kings, or 10, depending on which version of the tablet you're reading, because there are several, and they do not all agree with each other exactly, which is itself worth noting. And they assigned to those kings' reigns so long that scholars have been arguing about what those numbers mean ever since. We will move through each of those cities one by one. Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. We will ask what the tablets say about each of them. We will ask what archaeology has found or not found in the actual ground where those cities stood. We will ask what the flood means as a dividing line in ancient memory, and why so many ancient traditions from so many different places seem to carry some version of that same great water. But for now, just imagine the lamplight. Just imagine the tablet. Just imagine the reed pressing careful marks into wet clay, recording something the writer believed was almost too old for anyone to remember. So, what exactly is the Sumerian King List? The short answer is that it is a scribal composition, meaning it was produced in a scribal school or a temple administrative context, and it survives not as one original document, but as a collection of copies and fragments, some of them quite different from each other. Scholars have identified more than 20 manuscript witnesses, tablets and prisms and fragments from various sites and various periods, and they do not all say exactly the same things. Some versions include kings, others omit. Some give different numbers for the same reigns. The Well-Blundell prism, housed in Oxford, is the most complete single version we have. It is a 4-sided clay column inscribed on all faces, and it is the one most people picture when they think of the King List. But even it is one version among several, copied and recopied by students and priests working centuries after the events it claims to record. That matters. It means we are not reading a contemporary account written down as things happened. We are reading something composed, assembled, edited and shaped over time, with purposes that were at least partly political and theological, rather than purely documentary. The structure of the list itself is distinctive and almost hypnotic in its repetition. A city is named, a dynasty of kings is assigned to that city, each king is given a reign length. And then a brief formula appears, almost always the same words. That city was struck down, it says, or its kingship was carried to the next place. And then the next city begins, and so on, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, all the way down through Babylonian times, into periods where the kings are real historical figures whose names appear in other records, whose reigns match what we can independently verify. That movement of kingship from place to place is one of the document's central ideas. Kingship in this telling is singular. There is only ever one legitimate seat of power at any given time, and it moves, it is awarded, it is withdrawn, it descends from above and is taken up by whichever city the gods have chosen. This is not political neutrality. This is a theological argument. Whoever controls the narrative of where kingship currently resides controls something important about their claim to rule. And then there is the flood, set almost casually in the middle of the text, after the pre-flood kings have been listed and their enormous reigns recorded. The flood swept over, the text says. After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven again, the next dynasty begins, grounded in historical time, moving toward names we recognize. That line divides the document into 2 distinct zones. Everything before it exists in a kind of mythological deep time, a world of impossible numbers and cities that feel more like archetypes than municipalities. Everything after it inches toward the kind of history we can test. The flood is not explained. It is not described. It simply happens, one clause, and then the world continues. So when we read the King List, we're reading something that was never meant to be a neutral chronicle. It is a document with a worldview built into its grammar. Kingship is divine in origin. Civilization has a shape. It rises in particular places by divine intention, and it can be swept away, and it can begin again. That is the argument the scribes were making, and the pre-flood cities are where that argument begins. When the King List drops that simple line, the flood swept over, it is doing more than marking an event. It is drawing a boundary in time. On one side is what we might call mythic deep time, a vast, dimly lit expanse where numbers stretch into the tens of thousands of years, and kings seem to hover closer to gods than to ordinary people. On the other side is something that feels closer to the world we know. Shorter reigns, more cities, names that begin, slowly, to show up in other documents and inscriptions. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do this often. They draw a line, Before this, they say, the world was one way. After this, it is another. The flood is one of those lines. It is not just water. It is a hinge between eras. In many traditions, there is a concept of first time, a period when the patterns of the world were set. Egyptian texts call it the time when the gods first ruled. In Mesopotamia, the King List presents something similar. Before the flood, kingship itself is new. It has just descended from heaven. Cities like Eridu and Bad-tibira are not only places on the map, they are stages on which the first version of civilized order is tried out. These first-time narratives do particular work. They answer questions that every society eventually has to face. Why do we live this way and not another way? Why do these families rule? Why these rituals, these laws, these temples? By pushing the origins of kingship, of law, of sacred cities back into a distant, almost unreachable age, the authors of these texts make their institutions feel inevitable. If kingship comes from before the flood, if it is part of the structure of the universe itself, then present-day kings can claim to be standing in an ancient, almost cosmic tradition. The flood in the King List is not described in detail, but it functions as a reset. Everything that came before is sealed away behind waters and catastrophe. What comes after has to be granted again. Kingship must descend a second time. Cities must be chosen again. The world as the scribes know it is not simply a continuation, it is a restoration, a new beginning that remembers an older one. This is where sacred geography comes into view. In this way of thinking, not all places are equal. Certain cities are not just settlements, they are anchors in the story of the world. Eridu, Sippar, Shuruppak. These names recur in flood stories and king lists and myths about beginnings. They are remembered as the places that mattered when the first kings ruled, and again when the waters came, and again when life began anew. Sacred geography turns the map into theology. A city can be first not because it is archaeologically the oldest, but because it holds a symbolic place at the start of the narrative. It can be the city where kingship first descended, or the city that preserved wisdom before the flood, or the city that was granted a second chance after the waters receded. In that sense, the boundary of the flood is not only temporal, it is spatial. It separates not just a before and after in time, but a before and after in where the divine order rests. Lists and genealogies are one of the main tools ancient writers use to bridge that boundary. The King List is itself a list that crosses the flood line. It runs smoothly from the impossibly long-lived pre-flood kings straight into the more modestly scaled post-flood dynasties. There is no break in the grammar, only that brief mention of catastrophe. The message is subtle but powerful. There is continuity. Even when the world is overturned, kingship remains the same thing, coming from the same divine source, passing from hand to hand in a traceable sequence. You see the same strategy in genealogies, long lines of fathers and sons stretching back beyond any living memory, sometimes beyond even what the text can fully describe. In the Hebrew Bible, for example, the generations from Adam to Noah and from Noah to Abraham form chains that cross their own flood boundary. In later Mesopotamian texts, wise heroes and legendary kings trace their descent back to pre-flood figures. The details of that earlier world are vague. The numbers are strange, but the line is unbroken. This is how cultures make the unreachable past feel connected to the present, not by giving us a detailed year-by-year record, but by drawing a single thread of continuity through it. The flood is allowed to be absolute in one sense, a wiping clean, while at the same time something essential passes through unchanged. Kingship, wisdom, sacred cities, lineage. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to ask where, exactly, that boundary falls in our own timelines. Was there a particular flood? A specific period of rising waters or catastrophic river inundations that gave rise to these stories? Archaeology does show evidence of severe local floods in southern Mesopotamia at various points in the 3rd millennium BCE, and we know that sea levels and river courses have shifted dramatically in the broader region over thousands of years. It is possible that memories of such events contributed to the literary motif of a world-destroying flood, but the text itself does not encourage a simple one-to-one mapping. The King List flood is not anchored to a date we can verify. It is a literary and theological device as much as, or more than, a historical report. It compresses whatever experiences of catastrophe, loss, and renewal the culture carried into a single stylized turning point. That is worth keeping in mind. Mythic time can preserve something like memory. It can echo real floods, real displacements, real anxieties about the fragility of cities and kings. Yet it does so by rearranging, exaggerating, and simplifying. The flood as a boundary in the King List tells us most clearly how later Mesopotamian scribes wanted to see their world, as the inheritors of a pattern that had already been laid down before, interrupted by disaster and then graciously restored. So when we move from the abstract idea of before the flood into the specific pre-flood cities the list names, we are stepping into that mythic deep time zone. We are entering a landscape that is less about GPS coordinates and more about meaning. Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Each one will be presented as an early anchor point in that first cycle of kingship, a city that held the divine gift before the waters came and changed the world. In the King List, the very first stop in that deep pre-flood landscape is Eridu. The text states it with the same calm confidence it uses for everything else. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. No explanation, no build-up. It simply assumes you already know what that means. Eridu is where the pattern begins. In Mesopotamian tradition more broadly, that line would have made sense. Eridu is not just any city name. It is often remembered as the first city, the oldest seat of civilization, the place where human order and divine presence first settled down together. Later lists of temples put Eridu's shrine, the house of the god Enki, at the head of the sequence. Religious texts refer to it with epithets of antiquity and primacy. Again and again, Eridu is placed at the start. If you imagine a map of southern Mesopotamia in that mythic time, Eridu sits at the edge of water. Not on a high hill or a rocky outcrop, but low, in the marshlands where rivers, canals, and the sea once met. In Mesopotamian imagination, this is not a marginal place. It is a generative one. Civilization, in this way of thinking, does not begin in isolation, far from the water. It begins in contact with it, around reed-filled lagoons, silty channels, and man-made ditches cut to manage the restless flow. The heart of Eridu, in the stories, is its temple. The city is defined not by walls or markets, but by the sanctuary of Enki, lord of fresh waters and wisdom. The temple has a long Sumerian name, often translated as House of the Good Lord, or House Founded in the Deep. This is more than piety, it is spatial theology. The city is anchored on a god who lives in the underground waters, the Abzu, and whose power is imagined as a kind of subterranean reservoir of creativity and knowledge. When later texts picture the beginnings of ordered life, they picture it here. Priests performing rituals in a temple rising out of wetlands, canals drawing off water for fields, offerings and foodstuffs circulating between humans and their gods, all under the patronage of a deity associated with cleverness, craft, and the fertile depths. The first kingship, descending from heaven, finds its first home in a place already heavy with this imagery. The King List reflects that sense of priority, but it does so in its own distinctive, formulaic way. Once it is said that kingship came down and rested in Eridu, it moves immediately into a sequence of rulers. In Eridu, Alulim became king, He ruled 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled 36,000 years. The names are short and stark. There is no narrative attached, just a name, a city, and an impossibly long number. The style is almost hypnotic. City, king, number, city, king, number. It invites you to accept a rhythm rather than investigate a biography. We do not hear what Alulim did, what laws he gave, what battles he fought. We are told only that he reigned, and that his reign lasted longer than any human lifetime could. In that way, the text communicates something about scale. These are not historical reign lengths in our sense. They are signals that we are in a different register of time, closer to the gods. Later traditions will flesh out some of these bare names. Alulim, for instance, appears in other texts as a kind of culture hero, the first king, sometimes linked with the beginnings of agriculture and organised life. But in the king list itself, the emphasis is not on story. It is on sequence. Eridu holds kingship first. 2 kings reign for stretches of time that feel almost geological. Then kingship moves on. Parallel to the king list, another tradition about Eridu's beginnings develops in what modern scholars call the Eridu Genesis. This is a fragmentary Sumerian narrative that tells, in compressed form, of how the gods created humans, gave them cities and kingship, and then later decided to send a flood. In that text too, Eridu appears at the start, chosen by the gods as a first city, with its temple established and rituals set in place. The mood there is quiet and almost domestic before the catastrophe appears. Gods sitting in council, deciding that humans should have cities, temples being founded, names of early settlements spoken one after another. There is a sense of calm arrangement, of a world still new and being ordered. The later decision to flood that world feels like a rupture in something carefully laid out. Taken together, the king list's dry formulas and the Eridu Genesis's more narrative tone give us a composite picture of how the scribes imagined the beginning. Kingship comes down from heaven. It chooses Eridu. A temple rises in the marshy south. Rulers with godlike lifespans hold office while the channels are cut. The offerings are arranged. The first habits of city life take shape. Somewhere ahead, unspoken or only hinted at, there is already the possibility of a flood. But for now, the emphasis is on foundation, not destruction. When we turn from these texts to archaeology, we have to change gears. Modern excavations at the mound identified as ancient Eridu have uncovered a long sequence of temples built one atop another, going back into the 6th millennium BCE. The lowest levels reveal small shrines, modest structures that grow larger and more elaborate over time. Around them, archaeologists find traces of early settlement, mud brick buildings, hearths, refuse pits, later on more substantial architecture. The site lies in what would have been a very watery environment, near the ancient shoreline of the Gulf, surrounded by marshes and channels. In a broad, cautious sense, this matches the textual theme of a temple-centered community in the southern wetlands. There was indeed an early religious focus here. Ritual and water management probably did go hand in hand. Other southern sites, like Ur and Uruk, show similar patterns of temple complexes surrounded by settlements, all deeply entangled with canals and irrigation. But it is important not to press the match too far. The archaeological Eridu does not give us 28,800-year kings, or clear evidence of the named individuals in the king list. It gives us phases of building, layers of ash and fill, pottery styles changing over centuries, hints of gradual population growth and shifting religious practice. The first city in the texts is a symbolic position, as much as, or more than, a claim we can confirm with radiocarbon dates. What we can say is that southern Mesopotamia did see some of the earliest large temple-centered communities in the region. Eridu is one of them, and it is very old in archaeological terms. The scribes, looking back from their own time, chose to place the beginning of kingship there, at the edge of the marshes, in the house of the water god. They turned a real ancient city into the anchor point of their sacred geography. From Eridu in the King List telling, kingship will move on. The gift that first settled among reed beds and freshwater springs will be transferred to another city, with a new role to play in that first pre-flood cycle. The pattern will repeat. Name, reign, immense span of years. But each city adds a new shade to the picture of what before the flood meant. The next stop is Bad-tibira, and with it, the first stirrings of something like organized industry in the imagination of early Mesopotamia. In the King List, the transition is handled with the same unhurried certainty. Then Eridu fell. Kingship was taken to Bad-tibira. No description of upheaval, no story of conquest, just a statement that the divine office, which had once settled in the marshy sanctuary of Eridu, is now housed somewhere else. The city has changed, the kingship has moved. Bad-tibira in Sumerian carries a suggestive name. It is often rendered as Wall of the Metalworker or Fortress of the Smith. Already, in the way the syllables are glossed and interpreted by later scribes, we see a shift in emphasis. Eridu's identity is wrapped around a watery temple and a god of wisdom. Bad-tibira's remembered identity leans toward craft, production, and the shaping of hard materials. In other Mesopotamian sources, this impression deepens. Bad-tibira is associated with gods of metallurgy and of shepherding, Ilabrat or Lugalbanda in some traditions, the god Dumuzi in others. One later list of temples, for example, names its principal shrine as the dwelling of a divine herdsman. Elsewhere, the city is linked with deities who oversee smelting, furnace work, and the mysterious transformation of raw ore into gleaming tools and weapons. Taken together, these hints make Bad-tibira feel like a different kind of sacred centre. If Eridu is the place of water and ritual beginnings, Bad-tibira is the place where things are made and flocks attended. It is as if the scribes were mapping out not only a sequence of cities, but a sequence of activities that define urban life. The King List itself gives us very little in the way of detail. It continues in its steady cadence. In Bad-tibira, Enmenlu-Ana became king. He ruled 43,200 years. Enmengal-Ana ruled 28,800 years. Dumuzid the shepherd ruled 36,000 years. Again, the numbers are vast, again the reigns are bare of story, but one of the names carries a title, the shepherd. That small addition is telling. We are still in the realm of impossible lifespans, but suddenly the office of king is described with a pastoral role, the ruler as herdsman, the city as a place where flocks, and by extension people, are gathered, guarded, and directed. Later Mesopotamian royal ideology will make much of this metaphor. Kings of historical Ur and Babylon will call themselves shepherds of their people, those who cause justice and abundance to pasture. The King List association of a pre-flood ruler with shepherding may be an early, idealized reflection of that same image, projected back to the dawn of kingship. When you set these pieces side by side, the city called Wall of the Metalworker, the kingship transported there, the shepherd king whose reign stretches across aeons, a composite picture starts to form. Bad-tibira becomes, in memory, a place where two crucial aspects of early urban life are condensed: the management of animal wealth and the organized production of crafted goods. We have to move gently here. For the antediluvian period itself, archaeology cannot confirm that there was a real industrial quarter, or that large-scale metalworking was practiced in a city named Bad-tibira before any historical flood. The material record for early metallurgy in southern Mesopotamia is fragmentary, and the King List is writing from a much later vantage point. What we can say is that by the time these texts were composed, people in this region strongly associated Bad-tibira with the crafts of the furnace and with herding. That association is meaningful in itself. It suggests that when Mesopotamian scribes thought about what cities do, they thought about more than temples and canals. They thought about ore coming in from distant hills, being smelted and worked. They thought about flocks moving in and out, wool and meat and milk being recorded, distributed, perhaps tithed to the gods. They thought about labour that could be organised, skills that could be specialised, and materials that could be transformed. In that sense, Bad-tibira stands in the King List as a kind of emblem for early industry. Not industry in our modern smokestacked sense, but in the older sense of coordinated making. The furnace workers who understood fire well enough to pull metal from stone, the shepherds who knew the seasonal rhythms of grazing and lambing, the temple officials who, in later periods at least, would become deeply involved in managing these resources. There is a broad pattern in Mesopotamian religion in which different cities take on different divine and economic profiles. One city is remembered as particularly linked to grain and ploughing, another to writing and wisdom, another to war. The gods worshipped there, the stories told about them, and the economic roles those cities actually played in historical times all blend together into a kind of sacred geography. Bad-tibira's place in that map seems to sit at the intersection of metal and meat, of the hard shine of worked ore and the soft movement of animals at pasture. It is easy to imagine how this might have grown from real experiences. As communities became more complex, some places likely did become known for particular crafts or resources. A settlement near good grazing land might specialise in flocks. Another, with access to trade routes that brought in copper or tin, might develop skilled smiths. But we have to remember that the King List is not a travelogue or an economic survey. It is a literary and ideological document. When it tells us that kingship moved from Eridu to Bad-tibira, it is telling us, in compressed form, that legitimate power has a right relationship not only to sacred water and wisdom, but also to craft and herd. Cities in this vision are not interchangeable dots on a map. They are legitimate centres of power precisely because they are bound to certain gods and certain ways of life. The sequence, Eridu, then Bad-tibira, then other cities in turn, becomes a way of saying that different aspects of civilization took their turn at the centre of the world. Many of these associations were probably worked out long after the periods the King List describes. The memories of Bad-tibira as a metalworking and herding city may reflect how it functioned in the 3rd millennium BCE, or even how it was imagined in scholarly circles much later. From there, those images are pushed backward across the flood into that hazy time when kings are said to have lived for tens of thousands of years. This backward projection is part of what gives the pre-flood section its dreamlike quality. The cities are real names on the southern plain. Some of them are excavated sites with bricks and foundations, but their roles in the antediluvian era function more like symbols than like chronicle entries. Eridu is first city and water temple. Bad-tibira is smithy and sheepfold. In this way, sacred geography becomes a way of encoding social roles. The path of kingship across the land traces not just shifts in power, but an ordered sequence of what it means to be a city at all. To host a god, to manage water, to tend flocks, to work metal, to administer offerings. The King List does not lecture on these themes, it whispers them through names. From Bad-tibira, kingship will move again. Another city will rise into the text's narrow beam of attention, carrying with it a quieter presence, and leaving even fainter tracks in the stories that survived. As the list continues, the pre-flood landscape fills out, not with detail, but with an accumulating sense of patterned, purposeful order before the waters came. From Bad-tibira, the line moves on with the same untroubled assurance. Then Bad-tibira fell. Kingship was taken to Larak. The cadence doesn't change. The formula is familiar. A city declines, another rises. Kingship migrates as if carried on a slow, invisible current. But when we reach for Larak, our hands close mostly on air. Unlike Eridu, Larak does not come to us with a wealth of archaeological layers. Unlike Bad-tibira, it does not glow in later literature as a centre of craft or herding. It appears in the King List, it appears in a handful of later references, and then the trail goes thin. In the King List, its moment is brief. In Larak, Sippar became king. He ruled 28,800 years. A name, a city, another impossible duration. No divine epithet, no title like the shepherd, no elaborating story. To a modern reader, Larak feels like a minor character in a narrative that has already started to focus on more vivid figures. It enters, speaks one line, and exits. But that very thinness is part of what makes it significant. When you look closely, obscurity itself becomes a kind of evidence. Ancient Mesopotamian texts have not come down to us in a neat, complete package. They survive by accident and by selection. Clay tablets are durable, but only if they were fired by chance or preserved in particular conditions. Scribes copied some compositions again and again. Others were allowed to crumble. Whole libraries were burned, buried, reused as fill in new buildings. What we read today is only a fraction of what was once written, and what was written is only a fraction of what was once spoken and remembered. Larak lives right at the edge of that surviving fraction. Its name is there, just stable enough to be repeated in multiple copies of the King List, just clear enough that later scholars could still recognize it as a proper place. But whatever stories clustered around it, whatever temples it was said to house, whatever crafts or gods were associated with it, do not come through with the same clarity. That gap forces us to notice how the King List is doing its work. This is not a documentary in our sense. It is a shaped, curated sequence. When scribes in the early 2nd millennium BCE and later sat down to copy and update it, they were not improvising the past from nothing. They were handling inherited lists, older versions, local traditions. They were also making choices. Which cities to include, how many kings to assign, which variant spellings of a name to prefer, when to let a title, the shepherd, enter the line, and when to leave a king as just a name and a number. In the case of Larak, it seems that the framework mattered more than the details. The overall pattern required that kingship not simply jump from Bad-tibira to the next, better attested centre. There had to be an ordered sequence of cities, a gradual unfolding. Larak holds that place in the chain, even if the links around it are faint. Repetition and formula help stabilize this fading past. Each entry follows the same pattern. In city, king became king, he ruled years. The phrasing is almost hypnotic in its consistency. Like a litany, it allows variation to ride on a bed of sameness. City, name, number, next. For earlier scribes, this format would have made the list easy to memorize and transmit. For later scribes, it became a framework into which incomplete memories could be fitted. If you remembered that there had once been a city called Larak, somewhere in the pre-flood order, you could give it a king and a reign and slot it neatly between better-known points. The uniform structure is doing two things at once. It is smoothing over the roughness of memory, filling in gaps with the same comfortable rhythm, and it is marking those gaps by its very lack of elaboration. Against the relatively richer associations of Eridu and Bad-tibira, Larak's bare entry stands out as almost deliberately quiet. There are, beyond the King List, a few scattered echoes. Some later texts speak of a city or region that might be Larak, associated with a god of war or with the god Pabilsag, but the identification is debated. In some modern proposals, a tell here or a ruin there has been suggested as the physical counterpart of Larak, but the evidence remains uncertain. No inscription has yet been unearthed that says, clearly and confidently, I am the king of Larak. So we are left with a name on clay and the knowledge that scribes chose to keep that name, even when they had almost nothing else to attach to it. That choice is revealing. It tells us that for the compilers of the King List, continuity was more important than fullness. An incomplete city was preferable to a gap. A quiet entry was better than a broken line. The list is not trying to flood the pre-flood era with detail. It is trying to assert an unbroken line of kingship stretching from the first cities to the world after the waters. Larak is one of the stitches that holds that line together. If you imagine a long ancient scroll read aloud in a lamplit room, you can almost hear how this would work. The trained voice moved through the known names with confidence. Eridu, Alulim, Alalgar, Bad-tibira, Enmenlu-ana, Dumuzid the shepherd. Then, perhaps with the slightest pause, Larak, Ensipad-zid-ana, 28,800 years. The pause is not recorded, but the thinness of our surviving information suggests it. The scribe's memory might not have held a myth of Ensipad-zid-ana, but the formula carried him forward. City, king, years, next. In this way, the King List becomes both a record and a framework for remembering. It keeps alive names that might otherwise have been lost, even as the stories once attached to those names slip further and further from reach. There is something gently sobering in that. When we look back at this text across 4,000 years, Larak is not a set of ruins we can walk through, or a library we can reconstruct. It is a single word, repeated carefully in copies made centuries apart, a reminder that most of what once was, even in a civilization as text-loving as Mesopotamia, has vanished. Yet the very act of writing the name again and again has given it a kind of endurance. Eridu and Bad-tibira and Larak move through the centuries together, not as equal presences but as neighbours in a carefully preserved sequence. As you listen to this list of cities, you might feel a quiet kinship with that process. Our own histories, written in different media, are also uneven. Some lives are thick with records, letters, images. Others leave only a signature on a single document, a name in a registry, a mention in someone else's story. Over long stretches of time, even the richest archives thin out into a few surviving lines. Generations become a short genealogy. Events become headings in a chronicle. Whole cities can shrink to a single word in a text that happened to be copied one more time. Larak stands at that horizon, where memory condenses into almost pure outline. The King List does not lament this. It simply moves on, carrying kingship from one name place to the next, trusting that the act of naming is, in itself, a kind of preservation. For the scribes, it was enough that Larak once bore the divine office. For us, that quiet inclusion opens a space to reflect on how the vastness of the past narrows into a few names on clay, still whispering across millennia that there were more stories than anyone could ever write down. From Larak the line continues with the same steady rhythm. Then Larak fell. Kingship was taken to Sippar. Once again, the King List gives us no commentary, no explanation for the move. A city wanes, another brightens. The divine office migrates, but this time the destination is a place we can see more clearly. Sippar is not just a name on a list. In later Mesopotamian history it becomes one of the great cities of the north, famous for its temple to the sun god Shamash and its reputation as a centre of law, oaths and judgment. The pre-flood Sippar of the King List is thinly described. The entry reads, "In Sippar, Enmendu-ana became king. He ruled 21,000 years. A city, a king, another impossible number." But around those bare words, later tradition will build elaborate associations. Enmendu-ana will turn up in other texts as a wise figure taken up by the gods, and Sippar will emerge as a city where cosmic order is watched and measured. It is important to keep these layers apart. At the level of the primary text, the King List as we have it, Sippar's pre-flood role is simple. It is one in a chain of cities that bear kingship before the waters. No god is named here. No temple is mentioned. The list does not say why kingship moves there, only that it does. The fuller personality of Sippar comes from later sources and later centuries. Old Babylonian inscriptions celebrate Sippar as the seat of Shamash. Law codes and legal contracts invoke him as a witness. Shamash, judge of heaven and earth. Hymns describe him rising over the world, seeing everything, shining light into hidden places. In these texts, Sippar is not just a town on the Euphrates. It is the earthly node of the sun's all-seeing eye. When scribes in these later periods copied and used the Sumerian King List, they did so knowing this city as a solar and judicial centre. That knowledge would have coloured how they heard the name Sippar in the line about the antediluvian kings, even if they left the wording of the entry almost unchanged. Here we can cautiously explore a possibility, and we'll mark it as interpretation. It may be that Sippar's position in the pre-flood order was reinforced, or at least made especially meaningful, by its later religious profile. A city already famous as the place where the sun god sat in judgment, where scribes kept calendars and legal records, is a fitting place to imagine kingship dwelling in the distant time before the flood. If kingship is from heaven, as the opening of the King List insists, then setting that heavenly authority in a city associated with the daily path of the sun, and with the weighing of cases before divine judges, creates a neat thematic alignment. The text itself does not say this. It does not connect Sippar with Shamash or justice in its pre-flood section. But later readers, living within that cultic reality, could hardly have missed the resonance. We should also remember how a city like Sippar actually functioned when the King List was being copied. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Sippar was a centre of temple administration. The great sanctuary of Shamash managed fields and labourers. Priests and scribes tracked offerings, rents and ritual days. Clay tablets from Sippar preserve contracts, boundary agreements, court decisions. They date events by the year names of kings and by the cycles of festivals. They show how tightly time, law and divinity were braided together in the daily life of the city. Calendars were not abstract systems. They were tools to make sure rituals were held at the right moment, debts were paid when due, eclipses were noted, omens recorded. In temples like those at Sippar, scribes turn the regularity of the heavens into the regularity of social life. In that environment, kingship from heaven could be heard not just as a mythic image, but as something almost literal. Authority came from the gods whose movement set the calendar. Justice was administered in their courts. Oaths were sworn before the disk of Shamash carved on boundary stones and cylinder seals. To say that kingship had once come down and settled in Sippar was, for a later audience, to imagine that city as a place where cosmic order and human rule touched. Again, the King List itself does not spell this out. It only names Sippar. The rest is what scholars call thematic interpretation, reading the pre-flood sequence in light of what we know about how later Mesopotamians understood their cities and gods. There is another piece to this picture. Scribble schools. Sippar was one of the cities where young scribes learned to read and write cuneiform, copying lexical lists, hymns and narratives on clay. The King List itself, in its preserved copies, often appears in similar educational and scholarly settings. It was precisely in places like Sippar that the sequence of antediluvian cities and kings would have been rehearsed, memorized, and gently reshaped. Temples, calendars, and schools together create a powerful machine for cultural memory. The annual cycle of festivals keeps certain myths alive. Legal practice keeps divine names attached to ideas of justice and truth. Scribal copying transmits old compositions, sometimes adding colophons, sometimes harmonizing variant traditions. In that slow, careful work, a city's present identity can flow backward into its remembered origins. a later Sippar that sees itself as the city of the sun, the seat of law, will hear its own name in the ancient list and feel confirmed. Of course, kingship once rested here before the flood. Where else should the heavenly office dwell, if not in the place where the path of the sun is honoured and the scales of justice are watched? From a modern historical perspective, we have to separate these layers again. On one side, there is the primary evidence, the king list's bare statement that kingship came to Sippar, that Enmendurana ruled there for a fantastically long time, and that the sequence then moved on. On the other side, there are later texts that portray Sippar as a solar, judicial, and scholarly centre. When we connect them, we are not uncovering a hidden code in the king list. We are tracing how themes and associations could cluster in the minds of ancient readers and in the practices of ancient cities. For someone listening to the list in a lamplit room in Sippar itself, hearing the scribe chant, "In Sippar, Enmendurana became king," the line might have carried a quiet extra weight. It would link their own city, with its sun temple and its tablet rooms, to a time before the waters. It would suggest that the order they tried to keep, the measured days, the written laws, the watched horizons, was part of a much older story. We can acknowledge that possibility without claiming certainty. We can notice how well it fits the texture of Mesopotamian thought, where the present and the primordial are often mapped onto the same sacred places. And then, following the king list's own calm example, we let the sequence carry us onward. From Sippar, with its future fame as the city of the sun, kingship will move one last time before the boundary of the flood, to Shuruppak, a city that stands in the texts right on the edge of the waters. In the king list, the move is stated with the same unhurried formula. Then Sippar fell. Kingship was taken to Shuruppak. One more city, one more transfer of the heavenly office. But this time, the name sits in a very particular place in the sequence. Shuruppak is the last city listed before the flood. That placement is not an accident of copying. In every main version of the king list, no matter the small variations in wording or spelling, Shuruppak is the final stop on the pre-flood itinerary. After its king, the text does not simply move on to another city. It draws the boundary, then the flood swept over. So whatever else Shuruppak may have meant to Mesopotamian scribes, it functioned in this composition as the city at the waterline, the last firm ground before everything is washed away. The king list gives Shuruppak one king in the antediluvian section, Ubaratutu, who ruled 18,600 years. The pattern is familiar by now: one name, an impossibly long reign, and then the movement of kingship. But as with Sippar, later tradition quietly fills in the empty spaces around those few words. In the flood stories that survive from Mesopotamia, the human survivor, the one who builds the boat, rides out the waters, and receives a blessing at the end, is almost always linked to Shuruppak. In the Atrahasis epic, the hero is called Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. The god Enki, also called Ea, speaks to him through the wall of his reed house and warns him that the gods plan to send a flood. The text identifies him as a man of Shuruppak. In the standard Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor has another name, Utanapishti. He found life. But he too is described as living in Shuruppak, a city that you yourself know, which lies on the banks of the Euphrates. Gilgamesh travels to find him precisely because he crossed the boundary of death in the flood and was granted an enduring life. There is even an old Babylonian Sumerian tale that calls the hero Ziusudra. The version is fragmentary, but in later references he too is the king of Shuruppak who survives the deluge. The names change with language, period, and literary taste. Atrahasis, Utanapishti, Ziusudra. But the city remains the same. The man who hears the warning, builds the vessel, and steps out into a washed world is consistently anchored to Shuruppak. When we set that tradition beside the king list, an interesting alignment appears. The list does not mention Atrahasis or Utanapishti. It does not tell the story of the Ark. It only records Ubaratutu and his extraordinary years. Yet in some versions of the tradition, Ubaratutu is named as the father of the flood hero. The king at Shuruppak in the King List thus becomes the immediate ancestor of the one who will survive the waters. Taken together, these texts create a simple but powerful picture. Kingship, given from heaven, moves from city to city until it rests at last in Shuruppak. There it sits in the hands of Ubaratutu. His son will be warned, will build the boat, will live through the catastrophe that ends that first sequence of cities and reigns. Then the flood comes, and what stood before is wiped clean. Whether this genealogy is an original feature of the tradition or a later harmonization, we cannot say with certainty, but the effect is the same. Shuruppak becomes, in Mesopotamian cultural memory, the threshold city. Behind it, a long ordered world of pre-flood kings. Ahead of it, the great erasure and the fresh start. Having a last city before the flood does something important for the way the story feels. If the flood is entirely unmoored from named places and persons, it is sheer abstraction, cosmic reset without texture. By ending the pre-flood era in a specific town on the banks of a real river, the composition brings the waters right up to the edge of the familiar. Listeners in southern Mesopotamia knew the names of cities. They knew what it meant to live on the bend of a river, to see the floodplain shine under high water, to watch levees strain in the rainy season. Hearing that Shuruppak, this one particular city, stood just before the deluge would have made the catastrophe feel close, almost intimate. Not some disaster in a mythic nowhere, but something that came to the edge of a place like theirs, maybe to the very place some of them called home, the archaeological site usually identified with ancient Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, lies along an old branch of the Euphrates. Excavations there have uncovered evidence of occupation in the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BCE, long after the imagined antediluvian period of the King List, but still very ancient by human standards. Some layers show traces of flooding, silt deposits, signs of water damage. They are river floods, the sort that can devastate fields and houses, not literal world-ending events. We have to be careful not to draw straight lines. The flood of Utanapishti is not simply about one particular high-water year at Tel Farah. The King List boundary is a literary and theological line, not the mark of a single sediment layer. But it matters that Shuruppak was a real settlement on a vulnerable river plain, and that its name survived in the scribal tradition for many centuries. The same scribes who copied royal inscriptions and hymns also knew of old floods, eroded walls, abandoned quarters. When they wrote that the last pre-flood king ruled in Shuruppak, they were not choosing a purely imaginary place. In that sense, Shuruppak is where two kinds of memory meet. On one side is mythic memory, the carefully crafted stories in which a single flood becomes the hinge of cosmic history, the point at which human noise or sin forces the gods to start again. On the other side is local memory, the recollection of towns by the river, of people rebuilding after inundations, of older ruins half swallowed by silt and reeds. By fastening the hero to Shuruppak, and by placing Shuruppak at the end of the antediluvian list, Mesopotamian tradition ties the largest story it tells about destruction and renewal to a name that could be pointed to on a map. The edge of the waters is not nowhere. It is here, or near here, on the banks of the Euphrates. This is the work of scribal memory. Generations of literate specialists trained in temple schools copied and recopied texts about the kings and the flood. They preserved the sequence of Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. They also preserved narratives in which a man of Shuruppak survives when the flood swept over. In weaving these strands together, deliberately or simply by rote repetition, They fixed Shurupak's role as the hinge between worlds. For us, looking back, that hinge also marks a transition, from the geography of antediluvian cities to the strange chronology of their reigns. Up to this point, we have moved gently along the map, from one city to another, from temple to temple, from imagined early society to imagined early society. But the numbers attached to those kings have been quietly flowing under the surface the whole time, like a deep current. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 21,000 years, 18,600 years. With Shuruppak on the brink of the waters, the King List invites a shift in focus. What does it mean to say that these pre-flood rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years? How did ancient scribes understand such spans? And what happens to kingship from heaven when time itself is stretched almost beyond comprehension? From the city at the edge of the flood, we can now turn from places to periods, and from the line of cities to the problem of the reign lengths that define this first world. If we pause now and read the antediluvian portion of the King List straight through, the effect is almost hypnotic. After kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled 36,000 years. Two kings, they ruled 64,800 years. The list continues in the same calm voice. At Bad-tibira, Enmenluana ruled 43,200 years. Enmengalana ruled 28,800 years. Dumuzi the shepherd ruled 36,000 years. At Larak and Sippar ruled 28,800 years. At Sippar, Enmendurana ruled 21,000 years. At Shuruppak, Ubara Tutu ruled 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, a total of 241,200 years. Nothing in the clay tablets wavers or apologizes for these figures. They are not marked as exaggerations or as a special genre. They are given in the same flat, confident style as later reigns of 10, 20 or 40 years. But set beside anything in human experience, they stand out as almost impossible to think with, spans of time that swallow entire civilizations, lifetimes that reach across geological ages. So what do these numbers mean? One possibility is to see them not as measurements in our sense, but as symbols, numbers that point to qualities rather than quantities. In a culture like early Mesopotamia, where mathematics developed alongside astronomy, accounting and divination, certain numbers carried weight far beyond their use in counting sacks of grain. The Sumerians and their successors used a sexagesimal system built on the number 60. We still live with its traces. 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. In that system, blocks like 3,600 years, 60 times 60, a sar in later terminology, stood out as complete rounded units of significance. Many of the antediluvian reigns are made up of such units. 28,800 is 8 sars, 36,000 is 10 sars. Even where the fit is not exact, the numbers circle around these multiples, forming a pattern of immense but ordered time. From this angle, the long reigns may be less about saying this king literally lived 36,000 years, and more about saying this reign belongs to a different kind of time. It takes place in a world scaled up, a world where the normal rhythms of birth, rule, and death are stretched into almost abstract cycles. The point is not the stopwatch, but the sense of sacred enormity. Some scholars speak here of mythic time or great time. In this view, the antediluvian kings inhabit a zone of duration that is not meant to be plotted on a linear timeline. It is more like the long dawn in a story, the era when the gods still walk freely among humans, when basic institutions, kingship, cities, rituals are first taking shape. Giving those kings reigns of hundreds of Sars marks them as belonging to that age. It is a way of saying, this was before our kind of history began. Another lens looks at the numbers as part of what might be called prestige inflation. Royal inscriptions throughout Mesopotamian history like to push boundaries. Kings are strong kings, mighty kings, kings of the four quarters. Temples are from time immemorial. Lists of ancestors stretch back into legendary names. In such an environment, it is not surprising that an account of the very first kings should move into hyperbole. To emphasize the uniqueness and authority of archaic rulers, their reigns are magnified far beyond the plausible. From this perspective, the long reigns would be less about cosmology and more about rhetoric. They are the chronological equivalent of saying, in those days kings were truly kings. In those days rule was vast. Later, more modest reign lengths then register as a kind of decline, or at least as a narrowing of the gap between rulers and ordinary mortals. The sexagesimal framework and prestige logic are not mutually exclusive. They may well reinforce one another. A scribe working in a number system where 3,636,000 have special resonance might choose precisely those figures when inflating an ancient reign. Sacred arithmetic and royal boasting can travel together on the same wet clay. It is also worth noticing that Mesopotamia is not alone in using impossibly long lives to mark a foundational era. The genealogies in Genesis, for example, give the antediluvian patriarchs lifespans of 777 years, 900 years, 969 years. After the flood, those spans steadily contract, generation by generation, until human lives fall into a more familiar range. Early Chinese traditions speak of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, whose reigns stretch over tens of thousands of years. In India, the Puranic texts arrange history in vast yugas, or ages, whose lengths reach into millions of years. In each case, the earliest figures inhabit a kind of distended time, and later human history unfolds under a shorter sky. Across these traditions, scholars see similar patterns at work. Long-lived ancestors can signal proximity to the divine. They can create a spacious past in which to situate the origins of rituals, laws, and lineages. They also give societies room to dream back into a time when the world felt larger, slower, less precarious than the present. At the same time, we should be cautious about folding the Sumerian King List too quickly into any one cross-cultural template. The text we have is a specific product of Mesopotamian scribal culture, shaped by its own concepts of kingship, time, and cosmic order. Its numbers obey its own internal logic, tied to sexagesimal mathematics, temple chronologies, and local theological ideas about kingship from heaven. Modern interpreters have proposed many explanations. Some argue the reigns encode astronomical cycles, multiples of years mapped to planetary periods or precession. Others see traces of older, now lost traditions, perhaps lists of temple renovations or dynastic house lists whose totals have been misread as single reigns. Still others suggest that for some scribes, the numbers really were meant literally, even if we find that hard to imagine. None of these views commands universal agreement. The evidence is thin, scattered across broken tablets and later copies. The King List itself offers no commentary on its practice. It simply gives the figures and moves on. What we can say with some confidence is that these reigns are doing layered work. They place the first kings at a mythic distance, signal that a different quality of time is in play before the flood, and express, in the language of numbers, the conviction that early kingship was an institution of extraordinary weight and stability. The long spans also set up a contrast with what comes next. When the waters recede and kingship descends again, the durations of reigns suddenly drop, from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then to tens. Time tightens. History, in a recognizable sense, begins. To see how that tightening unfolds, we have to follow the king list across its own flood and watch what happens when heavenly kingship returns to earth on more human terms. When the king list says that kingship descended from heaven, it is not just offering a poetic flourish. It is compressing an entire ideology into a single line. In Mesopotamian thought, kingship was not simply a practical solution to organizing people. It was imagined as a fixed heavenly pattern that could be installed on earth in particular places at particular times. The gods, in this view, were not inventing kingship anew for each city. They were handing down a pre-existing office, a template of rule that always already belonged to the divine realm. This is why the verb to descend matters. Kingship does not emerge, evolve, or arise from the ground up. It falls into the world, complete. Human rulers are not founders of the institution, but tenants of a role that ultimately remains anchored above. In the local theologies of southern Mesopotamia, that descent was not abstract. Each great god had a preferred city, a temple that was considered their house on earth. Enki in Eridu, Inanna in Unug, Utu in Sippar, Enlil in Nippur. These temples were not just cult centres, they were cosmic hinges, places where heaven and earth were thought to meet. To say that kingship was in Eridu, or later in Kish, is to say that the god of that place had, for a time, entrusted the royal pattern to that city's sanctuary. Kingship, temple, and cosmic order formed a triangle. The king governed the people, but under the gaze of his city's god. The god resided in the temple, receiving offerings, issuing oracles, maintaining the rhythms of nature and society. The temple, in turn, grounded the god in a specific patch of earth, binding a universal power to a local community. When the system worked as it should, fields yielded crops, rivers rose and fell on schedule, enemies were held at bay, and justice, at least in the ideal, was upheld. The king list is steeped in this imagination. On its surface, it looks like simple political geography. Rule is in Eridu, then in Bad-tibira, then Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. After the flood, it goes to Kish, then Uruk, then and so on. But underneath, the movement of kingship reads like a moral and theological map. Cities are not just dots on a river plain, they are judged by whether they are worthy bearers of the heavenly institution. To be named as a seat of kingship is to be woven into a sacred chronology. To be omitted is to linger off stage, important perhaps in local memory, but not in the grand story of how divine order has been mediated through time. This is one reason the flood boundary is so powerful. Once the waters have swept over the land, kingship must descend again. The chain is not broken. There is no new invention of authority, no fresh contract between humans and gods. There is only the re-establishment of an old pattern in a new setting. First Eridu, then Kish. First the primal city of wisdom, then the post-flood city that will anchor later dynasties. By arranging his material this way, the scribe turns messy political history into a flow of legitimacy. Real rulers in Mesopotamia fought, rebelled, usurped, and compromised. City-states rose and fell through wars, alliances, and happenstance. But on the tablet, all that turbulence is smoothed into a single stream. One dynasty follows another because the office itself, kingship from heaven, requires an unbroken sequence. Later kings benefit enormously from this arrangement. To appear on the king list is to be folded into a continuous line that reaches back to Alalim and the first days of Eridu. However recent, however contested their actual power might have been, a dynasty that finds its name written in that clay acquires depth. Its authority is no longer just the outcome of a successful coup or a lucky marriage alliance. It becomes the latest expression of a pattern that began before the flood. Even gaps and oddities in the list can serve this logic. Some cities host only a single brief dynasty before kingship moves on. Others recur after long absences. The impression is not of randomness but of assessment. Kingship, it seems, can be withdrawn as well as bestowed. If a city fails, morally, ritually, politically, the gods can relocate their earthly office elsewhere. Geography becomes a record of divine favour and displeasure. None of this means that the King List is a simple reflection of what anyone in early Mesopotamia really believed in a literal sense. It is a crafted document, shaped in scribal schools where young students copied, collated and reimagined older traditions. By the time our surviving versions were written, the flood story, the first kings, and the movements of dynasties had already passed through many hands, many retellings. But precisely as a scribal product, the list shows us how the past was being made usable. A scribe in the early 2nd millennium BCE lived in a world of shifting empires, competing temples, and overlapping claims to rule. By weaving antediluvian kings, legendary cities, and recent dynasties into one continuous thread, he offered his patrons more than a chronicle. He gave them a way to think about their own position. If kingship has always descended from heaven, if it has always moved from city to city according to hidden criteria, then present rule is not an accident. It sits inside a story that the gods themselves have been telling since before the waters rose. In that sense, kingship from heaven is less about proving that gods literally dropped crowns from the sky, and more about anchoring human power in a framework of cosmic order. The phrase says, your city, your king, your temple are not just temporary facts. They are episodes in a long, carefully arranged history of how the divine pattern of rule has touched the earth. And as generations of scribes recopied the list, adjusting details, adding recent dynasties, they renewed that claim. With each fresh impression on wet clay, the remote past and the living present were drawn together again, joined by the same descending thread. The King List gives us the skeleton of the story: cities, kings, the flood as a dividing line, kingship descending again. But on its own it is almost entirely bare of feeling. We're told that the waters swept over the land, but not why. We are told that kingship resumes afterward, but not how anyone survived to receive it. For that, later Mesopotamian tradition preserves another text, the Atrahasis epic. Atrahasis survives in cuneiform tablets copied in the 2nd millennium BCE. The best-known version comes from Old Babylonian scribal schools, around the same period when some forms of the King List were being written and recopied. What we have is not complete. Several sections are broken, and scholars reconstruct parts of the narrative from parallel passages and later adaptations, including the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But even in its damaged state, Atrahasis gives us the closest thing we have to a fully worked-out Mesopotamian theory of why the flood happened and what it meant. At the start of the poem, there are gods and there is work. The high gods, led by Anu in heaven and Enlil on earth, have divided authority. Beneath them, a class of junior gods labours to maintain the world, digging canals, raising embankments, tending the infrastructure that makes life in Mesopotamia possible. In the extant lines, they complain. Their work is hard, endless, and there is no relief. In one dramatic scene, the lesser gods throw down their tools, surround Enlil's house, and threaten revolt. This is the first crisis. The solution, in the poem, is the creation of humans. On one tablet, we read how the goddess Nintu, or Mami, mixes clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, a sacrificed divine labourer, to form a new kind of being. Humans are fashioned specifically to take over the work: canal digging, irrigation, field maintenance. The burdens that provoke divine rebellion are shifted downward onto human shoulders. The cosmos is stabilized by outsourcing. For a while, It seems to work. But the story does not end there. As generations pass, the human population increases. With more people comes more activity, more offerings, more sound. The tablets describe this in a simple, arresting phrase: humankind makes too much noise. The din rises up to heaven, Enlil cannot sleep. The very success of creation, the multiplication of human workers, the flourishing of settlements, becomes, in the poem, a new kind of crisis. Here we see the core logic of Atrahasis. The problem is not that humans are wicked in a moral sense, at least not in the language that survives. It is that they are out of balance. Their numbers, their noise, their impact on the cosmos have exceeded what the divine order can tolerate. The flood, when it finally comes, is not random. It is the last in a series of escalating divine attempts to restore equilibrium. Before the flood, the gods try softer measures. The tablets show Enlil proposing ways to reduce the human population: plague, drought, famine. Each time, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise man who gives the poem its name, receives warning through the god Enki, or Ea, his protector. Each time, Atrahasis devises a countermeasure. He organizes rituals to appeal to the gods, instructs his people to adjust offerings, modifies how the community lives. The disasters are blunted, then lifted. Balance is temporarily restored. These episodes are fragmentary in the surviving tablets, and some details of the plagues and famines are reconstructed by comparison with later texts, but the pattern is clear enough. Human society responds to divine pressure. Ritual and social adjustments can avert catastrophe, up to a point. Eventually, Enlil becomes determined to wipe out humankind altogether. Other gods agree, bound by an oath of silence. Enki, who is both wise and sympathetic to humans, cannot openly defy the divine assembly, but he looks for a loophole. In the preserved lines of one tablet, he speaks not to Atrahasis directly, but to a wall or to the reed structure of a house, within earshot of the human he wants to save. He tells the wall that a flood is coming, that the gods have sworn to send waters to sweep away all life. What follows shades into familiar motifs known from other flood traditions. Atrahasis is instructed to dismantle his house, build a boat, load it with the seed of life and representatives of living creatures. The precise dimensions and technical details in the old Babylonian Atrahasis text are partly broken, and later scribes, including those who worked on Gilgamesh, seem to have elaborated them. But the essential pattern is firmly attested. Warning, preparation, preservation, survival. The flood itself is described as overwhelming. In the surviving lines from Atrahasis and its later relatives, the storm rages, the earth cracks. The gods themselves are terrified at the scale of the destruction they have unleashed. Some flee to the highest heaven. Others sit weeping by the outer wall of the sky. The waters cover the land. The noise of humans is gone. When the boat comes to rest and Atrahasis emerges, he offers sacrifices. The gods, who have been hungry during the long silence of offerings, gather like flies over the smoke. This striking image is preserved in multiple manuscripts. It expresses in a single line the mutual dependence that lies at the heart of Mesopotamian theology. Humans need the gods for protection and order. The gods in turn rely on humans for food, praise, and the rhythms of cult. Enlil, seeing that some humans have survived, is furious, but Enki argues that total annihilation was a mistake. The logic of the poem turns here. Rather than erasing humanity, the gods must find a way to keep human impact within acceptable limits. In the damaged conclusion of the epic, we glimpse the solution: new measures to control population and noise, shortened lifespans, infant mortality, restrictions on fertility. The details are debated among scholars because the relevant lines are broken and must be partly reconstructed. but the idea is consistent. Catastrophe leads to a new, harsher, but stable arrangement between humans and divine powers. Atrahasis, then, offers something like a moral ecology. Human society, divine decision-making, and natural disaster are linked in a single feedback loop. Too much human flourishing without restraint leads to divine counteraction, plagues, droughts, flood. Human wisdom, embodied in Atrahasis, can mitigate or delay these consequences but not eliminate them. In the end, survival depends on learning to live within a framework of limits that the gods enforce. Many of the motifs we recognize from other flood accounts appear here in early form. A righteous or wise individual singled out for warning, the construction of a vessel, the preservation of animals and seed, a devastating flood that marks the end of an age, a sacrifice offered afterward, a new start under new conditions. At the same time, Atrahasis is not simply a universal myth. It is a Mesopotamian one, tied to their specific vision of labour, irrigation, and the fragile balance of life on the alluvial plain. What we can read on the clay tablets grounds this vision. We can point to particular lines about the gods' sleeplessness at human noise, to the revolt of the junior gods, to the negotiation over population control after the flood. Where the tablets are broken, exact boat specifications, full lists of divine decrees, some speeches, we have to move more carefully, distinguishing between what is certain, what is probable by comparison with parallel texts, and what remains speculative. Placed alongside the Sumerian King List, Atrahasis fills in the silence around the flood boundary. The list tells us that the flood swept over, and that kingship later descended again to Kish. Atrahasis imagines what that sweeping over felt like, why it came, how a remnant survived long enough for kingship to be reinstalled. It does not name Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak or Shuruppak directly in the surviving Old Babylonian version, but it inhabits the same conceptual world. Cities as nodal points in a relationship between heaven and earth, human excess as dangerous, divine order as both protective and terrifying. In that sense, the epic does for the flood what the King List does for kingship. It does not give us a documentary record of a single historical event. It gives us a way ancient scribes and their audiences made sense of the idea that there had been a before and an after, separated by waters. The list marks the line in ink. Atrahasis colours it in with voices, motives, and consequences. Together they show how deeply the memory of a great dividing flood was woven into Mesopotamian attempts to understand their cities, their rulers, and their place in a world that could at any time rise up and sweep everything away. Atrahasis gives us a tight, almost legal logic for the flood. Labour, revolt, outsourcing, overgrowth, correction. But in the Mesopotamian library there is another, quieter voice that tells the story from a slightly different angle. Modern scholars call it the Eridu Genesis. What survives of this text comes from a single, badly broken tablet, copied in Sumerian and found at Nippur. Large portions are missing. Many lines are reconstructed only in outline, but enough remains to see its general shape. It is another flood story. It overlaps with Atrahasis and the King List, and yet its tone, as far as we can hear it through the damage, is noticeably softer. Instead of beginning with overworked gods, the Eridu Genesis starts with something closer to a cosmogony. It tells how the great gods establish the ordering of the world. Heaven and earth are separated, names are assigned, basic institutions are put in place. In one sequence, we read that the gods create the first cities, and among them, Eridu. Here, the founding of Eridu is not a political afterthought. It is built into the architecture of creation itself. In the surviving lines we hear that kingship, agriculture, and cult are set up together. Temples are installed as soon as cities exist. the language suggests an original harmony, a world in which human settlement and divine presence are aligned from the beginning. Eridu is not just a town on a marshy shoreline. It is the place where civilization, in Sumerian memory, first crystallizes. Then, only after this slow, almost ceremonial establishment of order does the possibility of flood approach. Where Atrahasis emphasizes human noise and divine irritation, the Eridu Genesis, as far as we can see, moves more gently. The text speaks of the gods deciding on a flood, but the reasons are less explicit in the surviving portions. There may have been allusions to human behavior, perhaps some breach of order, but the tablets do not preserve a detailed indictment. What they preserve instead is the reaction of one god in particular, Enki, the same deity who protects Atrahasis. In this version, Enki warns a man named Ziusudra, a king and priest associated with Shuruppak in later tradition. The warning is familiar in outline. A great flood is coming. The divine assembly has sworn to send waters that will erase the settled world. Ziusudra is instructed to build a large boat to preserve life. But the fragments of Eridu Genesis linger less on technical details and more on what happens afterward. According to the surviving text, Ziusudra survives the deluge. His boat comes to rest. He offers sacrifice. And then, in one of the clearest and most moving lines, we read that the great gods grant him life like a god, placing him in the distant place, at the mouth of the rivers. Here the flood is not just an act of culling, as in Atrahasis. It is also an occasion for elevation. A human who has kept faith, maintained cult, and listened to divine instruction is lifted out of ordinary mortality. The world after the flood is not just harsher, it is also, in some sense, blessed by the presence of a human who has crossed the boundary between eras. When we set the Eridu Genesis beside the King List and Atrahasis, a pattern emerges. The King List says that kingship first descends to Eridu, then moves from city to city, and that after the flood it resumes at Kish. Atrahasis explores the reasons for the flood and the mechanisms of survival. The Eridu Genesis seems to knit those threads together, framing the whole story within an Eridu-centered sacred geography. In this geography, Eridu is more than a first entry on a list. It is a primordial temple city, anchored in ritual memory. To say that kingship descended there is to say that the link between heaven and earth was first secured at that spot. When later scribes in Nippur or Babylon wrote about the flood, they were not only recording a disaster, they were also reaffirming that the institutions they knew, kings, temples, offerings, had roots that reached back before the waters and had been renewed afterward. The Eridu Genesis reinforces this sense of civilization as something instituted, fragile and renewable. Instituted because cities and kingship arrive in the story as gifts or assignments from the gods. No human figure in these texts invents the city. Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak come into being when divine powers decide that it is time for settled life, fields and cult to take shape. Fragile, because that arrangement can be swept away. The decision for flood in Eridu Genesis feels less like an angry outburst and more like a solemn decree. The world we know, with its cities and rituals, can be turned off. The institutions that underpin order rest on a foundation that can be withdrawn. And renewable, because after the waters recede, the story does not end in emptiness. Ziusudra is granted continued life. Kingship descends again, in the King List's formula. Altars are rebuilt. Temple memory stitches the two sides of the flood together, so that post-flood cult can claim continuity with pre-flood arrangements, even if the landscape has changed. Seen this way, the flood in Mesopotamian tradition is not one single story told in one single way. It is a cluster of related narratives, overlapping but not identical, each emphasizing different aspects of the same imagined boundary. Atrahasis stresses labor, noise, and the regulation of human impact. The Eridu Genesis leans toward cosmic order, sacred cities, and the survival of a pious king. The King List turns the whole complex into a bare chronological axis. Before the flood, after the flood. Together, they suggest that ancient Mesopotamians did not think of one definitive flood story that everyone agreed upon. Instead, they preserved multiple, partially competing, partially harmonizing memories and theological reflections on what it means for a world of cities and kings to end and then begin again. Later authors, in other languages, would revisit this same imagined catastrophe, introducing new characters and new emphases. One of the most famous is a king who goes in search of the flood survivor himself, hoping to learn the secret of how to cross the line between human and divine. His name is Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh enters the tradition a long time after Ziusudra and Atrahasis, but the questions his story asks are the same ones that hang over the King List and the Eridu Genesis. In the old Babylonian poems and in the later standard version, Gilgamesh is introduced as a king of Uruk, mighty, restless, and very much post-flood. The cities are standing, the temples are active, kingship has long since resumed its path from Kish to Uruk and beyond. But in this settled, familiar world, one thing remains unsettled: death. Gilgamesh begins his epic as a man who thinks limits do not apply to him. He builds walls that dazzle the eye. He takes whatever he wants. He defeats monsters in the cedar forest and crosses mountain passes that no one from Uruk has seen before. Yet the turning point of the story is not a victory, it is a loss. When his companion Enkidu dies, the noise that fills the poem is no longer the noise of overpopulation, as in Atrahasis, but the raw crying of a single bereaved king. Gilgamesh looks at his friend's body and sees for the first time what it means to be mortal. His terror drives him outward, beyond his own city, beyond even the orbit of the known gods. Somewhere, he has heard, there is a man who escaped the flood and who did not die. That man is Utnapishtim. In the standard Akkadian version of the epic, Utnapishtim is presented as a distant, almost inaccessible figure. He lives at the mouth of the rivers, in a faraway place that sounds very much like the distant place of Ziusudra in the Eridu Genesis. Gilgamesh has to pass through total darkness, cross lethal waters, and withstand cosmic winds just to reach him. The journey itself marks the edge between ordinary royal life and the deep past. When Gilgamesh finally stands before Utnapishtim, the flood story is told again, but now framed as the answer to a personal question: can a human ever truly escape death? Utnapishtim begins, like Atrahasis, with a divine council. In his account, it is Enlil who decides to send the flood, and Enki, here called Ea, who warns the chosen man. The motifs are familiar: the secret warning, the construction of a vast boat, the loading of animals and craftsmen, the shutting of the door as the storm breaks. The waters in Gilgamesh are violent and close to mythic. The text speaks of a terrifying tempest, of the gods themselves cowering like dogs, of the land flattening like a roof. The rain does not just rise, it attacks. As in Atrahasis, the flood is both physical and cosmic, an unmaking of the ordered world. Yet there are shifts in emphasis. Atrahasis spends time on the build-up, the overpopulation, the repeated attempts at partial solutions, the negotiations between deities. In Utnapishtim's telling, those justifications are truncated. The focus moves to secrecy and exception. Ea is careful to avoid directly betraying the divine oath. He speaks to the wall of Utnapishtim's house rather than to Utnapishtim himself. The chosen survivor is singled out, not as the representative of a class of noisy labourers, but as the bearer of a hidden favour. We also see a stronger sense of ritual closure. Utnapishtim releases birds to test the waters, just as other flood traditions will have their hero send out a raven and a dove. He offers a sacrifice when he emerges, and the gods gather like flies over the sweet smell. The language is vivid but also strangely domestic. The cosmos is reset through something as ordinary as the smoke of roasted offerings. Then comes the crucial difference. In Atrahasis, the flood leads to a reorganization of human life. Shorter lifespans, sterility demons, a new balance between people and gods. In Utnapishtim's story, the outcome is focused on one man and his wife. Enlil, at first enraged that any human has survived, is eventually placated. He grants Utnapishtim and his spouse a unique status. They will dwell far away at the mouth of the rivers and live like the gods, outside the usual cycle of birth and death. This is where the figure of the survivor acquires a new narrative function. Ziusudra, in the Eridu Genesis, is moved to the distant place as a sign of divine favour and as a guarantor of continuity across the flood boundary. Utnapishtim inherits that role but also becomes something else, a living fossil of the pre-flood world. When Gilgamesh meets him, he is meeting not just a wise elder, but a man who personally remembers cities that no longer exist, kings whose reigns stretch into the thousands of years, and a time when the boundary between gods and humans was drawn differently. Utnapishtim is, in effect, the human hinge between two orders of reality. The epic uses him to dramatize the fact that the pre-flood and post-flood worlds are not simply separated by an impersonal disaster. They're connected by memory, by testimony, by a single pair of eyes that saw both. The answer he gives Gilgamesh is not the one the hero wants. Utnapishtim tells him plainly, "The life I have is a one-time exception. The gods will not do this again. No secret technique, no hidden herb, no clever ritual will let an ordinary king cross that line." Even when Utnapishtim briefly offers Gilgamesh a plant of rejuvenation, this story arranges for it to be stolen by a serpent. The chance slips away. The flood survivor holds the story of immortality and demonstrates that it cannot be replicated. Behind this meeting stands a long tablet tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh did not exist as a single fixed book. It was copied by generations of scribes in Sumerian and Akkadian, reshaped into different versions, arranged on tablets that could be excerpted for teaching. Some tablets carry only the flood episode. Others integrate it into the larger life of Gilgamesh. In scribal schools, students practice by copying these lines, absorbing not only the language but the theology, the idea that there was once a different world swept away, whose last witness now speaks from the edge of time. As these stories were taught and retaught, motifs moved between them. Elements of Atrahasis appear inside Gilgamesh. Echoes of Eridu Genesis can be felt in Utnapishtim's distant dwelling. Later Akkadian redactors adjusted speeches, tightened plot lines, and highlighted certain themes, like the futility of seeking eternal life, that may not have been as prominent in earlier forms. The flood narrative within this tablet culture was not a static relic but a living text, slowly turning as it passed from hand to hand. When we look beyond Mesopotamia, we find other flood accounts that share some of these features: a righteous or favoured human, a divinely ordered boat, animals preserved, birds sent out, a sacrifice offered after the waters recede. The most famous for many modern readers is the story of Noah in the Book of Genesis. The similarities between Utnapishtim's tale and the biblical account are striking enough that scholars have long suspected some kind of connection. But the path of influence is unlikely to have been simple or direct. Between early Sumerian poems, Old Babylonian Atrahasis, the standard Epic of Gilgamesh, and the much later Hebrew texts, we are dealing with centuries of oral storytelling, regional traditions, translations, and reinterpretations. Rather than imagining one culture straightforwardly copying another, it may be more accurate to picture a shared flood repertoire circulating around the ancient Near East. a pool of images and narrative patterns, sometimes borrowed, sometimes resisted, sometimes reworked to fit new theologies. Mesopotamian scribes, West Semitic storytellers, and later biblical authors were all dipping into overlapping currents of memory and myth. Gilgamesh's journey to Utnapishtim sits near the centre of this web. It crystallizes older Mesopotamian ideas about pre-flood kings and cities, gives them a voice in the person of the survivor, and then turns the whole tradition into a meditation on what humans can and cannot hope for. In the next step of our story, that meditation will surface again in a very different register. Genealogies, covenants, and a flood narrative framed not by a questing king, but by a family chosen to walk with their God. When the book of Genesis tells its flood story, it does not begin with a king or even with a city. It begins with a list of names: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. Father to son, generation after generation. The rhythm is simple, almost hypnotic. A man lives, begets, continues, and dies. What breaks the pattern is not an earthquake or a political coup, but a quiet accumulation of time and a build-up of human wrongdoing. Here, early time is not mapped by reigns and dynasties, but by genealogies. If the Sumerian King List marks the ages before and after the flood with cities, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Genesis marks them with people. The line from Adam to Noah is its own kind of king list, but instead of thrones and capitals, it tracks fathers, sons, and the years that stretch between them. Those years are startlingly long. Adam lives 930 years. Methuselah, famously, 969. The numbers do in narrative form what the thousands of years' reigns did in Mesopotamian texts. They stretch the pre-flood world away from us, make it feel qualitatively different, half-lit and distant. But they also domesticate it. Instead of mythic monarchs ruling for 28,800 years, we have families farming, begetting children, calling on the name of their god. In both traditions, long lifespans and impossible chronologies are one way to make origins intelligible. When you stand at the far end of memory, the line back to the beginning is unimaginably long. Lists of kings or of ancestors turn that ungraspable span into a series of steps. Each name is a rung on a ladder down into the dark. When Genesis finally reaches the flood itself, some motifs will sound very familiar to anyone who has listened to Atrahasis or to Utnapishtim. There is a divine decision to send a deluge. There is a chosen human, warned ahead of time, told to build an ark and bring in animals and family. The waters rise high enough to cover the land. Afterwards, birds are released to test the ground. A sacrifice is offered. A promise is made that this event will not be repeated in the same way. But around these shared images, there are important differences in framing and tone. In the Mesopotamian accounts, the flood is bound up with questions of cosmic management. The gods are burdened by human noise. They lose sleep. They experiment with plagues and droughts, searching for a way to keep the world habitable without giving up human labour. The final deluge is an extreme measure in a long debate about population and order. In Genesis, the stated cause shifts from noise to moral corruption. The text speaks of the earth being filled with violence, of human thoughts and inclinations tending only toward evil. The flood is not simply a response to quantity, but to quality, not to the volume of humanity, but to its behaviour. The grief in the divine reaction is emphasized, a God who is portrayed as saddened, even pained, by what the world has become. And where the King List and Atrahasis use the post-flood moment to explain institutions, shortened lives, new categories of people, new divine regulations, Genesis wraps its story in the language of covenant. After the waters recede and Noah steps out onto dry ground, the sacrifice he offers is answered not only with relief, but with a formal commitment. there is a promise made to all living creatures, marked by the sign of a rainbow, that the earth's rhythms of seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not again be interrupted by such a total destruction. The focus is not just on why the disaster came, but on how the relationship between God, humans, and the rest of creation will continue afterwards. This covenantal frame is one of the clearest distinctions between the biblical tradition and the earlier Mesopotamian materials we can read. It does not erase the parallels, it sets them into a new theological pattern. The genealogies on either side of the flood deepen that pattern. Before the waters, the line of Adam to Noah presents a single human family stretching over centuries. After the waters, another genealogy unfurls from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, branching into nations and languages. Where the Sumerian King List uses its pre- and post-flood segments to anchor city histories and royal identities, Genesis uses its 2 genealogical trees to anchor a picture of humanity as a whole and to situate one particular family, that of Abraham, within that larger story. In both cases, list-making is doing heavy cultural work. Ancient scribes in Mesopotamia and in the wider Near East did not collect names and numbers as neutral data. King lists, city lists, temple inventories, priestly genealogies, all of these were ways of saying, this is who we are, this is how we came to be here, this is why our institutions matter. A dynasty could legitimize itself by tracing its rule back across the flood boundary. A priestly family could claim authority by linking itself to an ancestor named in a sacred record. Genesis operates within that same broad scribal habit, but reshapes it. Its genealogies are not just chains of biological descent. They are narrative spines that hold together stories of gardens, wanderings, covenants, and promises. To read them in their ancient context is to see not a dry list, but an ordered memory, crafted to preserve identity under changing political realities. Exile, return, foreign rule. How exactly these traditions relate to Mesopotamian texts is a question that does not have a simple answer. The flood story in Genesis shows patterns that are very close to Atrahasis and to Utnapishtim. The ark, the animals, the sequence of birds, the post-flood sacrifice. Many scholars think later Israelite authors or editors, living in a world where Babylonian literature was known, were aware of these older materials or of oral versions descended from them. Others suggest that what we are seeing is not direct borrowing from a single tablet, but the use of a shared ancient Near Eastern flood repertoire, long circulating motifs and story shapes that different cultures adapted to their own gods, ethics, and memories. From the text alone, it is difficult to distinguish between these possibilities with certainty. The Hebrew narrative is much later than the earlier Sumerian and Akkadian compositions, but the pathways of influence, oral recitation, school traditions, regional tales, are complex and only partly visible. What we can say is that Genesis and the Mesopotamian tablet traditions are participating in a common project. They are trying to remember a world before the familiar one, to mark a dividing line in time, and to connect their present communities to those remote beginnings through carefully chosen names, numbers, and stories. For the compilers of the Sumerian King List, that connection runs through antediluvian cities and impossibly long-reigning kings. For the authors and editors of Genesis, it runs through genealogies, covenants, and a flood told as part of a family's walk with their God. Both ways of remembering place the flood not just in the landscape but in the lineage. Both create a bridge from then to now that later generations could walk across whenever they recited the names. When we turn from these texts to the ground itself, the picture changes texture. The flood in Atrahasis, in the Eridu Genesis, in Genesis, is a single world-defining rupture. Archaeology, by contrast, deals in layers. It reads the past not as one sweeping catastrophe, but as meters of accumulated time, mud brick on mud brick, ash on ash, silt on silt. In southern Mesopotamia, the earliest levels of cities like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, and others show us what we can safely call early urbanism. Dense clusters of houses built of sun-dried brick, temples rising on platforms, narrow lanes with drains, storage jars sunk into packed earth, rubbish pits slowly filling. Over centuries, these layers stack up into what archaeologists call deep stratigraphy, a vertical archive of daily life and gradual change. But that archive is uneven. The same forces that built Mesopotamia's cities also eroded them. Rivers shifted course, canals cut through old neighbourhoods, later builders quarried ancient bricks to raise new temples. Some sites are preserved like time capsules, others have been scoured, trampled or buried beyond easy reach. The record we have is detailed in places, patchy in others, and always incomplete. This is one of the reasons it is so difficult to point to a particular layer and say, here is the pre-flood city of Eridu, here is antediluvian Shuruppak, exactly as the King List imagined them. We can identify ancient Eridu, and we can trace its long history from a modest ritual centre by a marsh to an important cult city. We can excavate Shuruppak and see that it was a real settlement with houses, streets and archives. We can date levels in these sites broadly to the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, the same world in which later scribes wrote about early kings. But the textual before the flood is not a simple label that maps neatly onto one archaeological horizon. The scribes who compiled the King List were looking back across centuries of building and rebuilding. Their before and after are cultural categories, not stratigraphic ones. What about the flood itself? At several Mesopotamian sites, excavators have found layers of river-laid silt sandwiched between levels of human occupation. At Shuruppak, Kish, and a few others, there are deposits that look like the result of significant flooding. Clean water-borne sediment, sometimes with evidence that buildings beneath were damaged and later rebuilt. These layers are interesting, and they have been discussed for more than a century as potential flood layers. But each one is local. Each belongs to the history of a particular bend in a particular river. Their dates do not line up perfectly from site to site, and our dating methods, especially for early levels, always come with margins of error. A flood layer at Shuruppak might represent a devastating inundation for that city around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. For the people who lived there, it could have felt apocalyptic, yet that does not mean the same event covered all of Mesopotamia, or that it is the single historical kernel behind every flood tradition. It is one piece of a larger, more complicated mosaic. Archaeologists are very cautious here. Silt alone cannot tell us whether survivors saw their experience as a punishment from the gods, as a random disaster, or as part of a remembered pattern stretching back into oral tradition. Soil does not speak in stories. It tells us that water came, that it stood long enough to lay down sediment, that people eventually returned or moved away. The meaning of that water belongs to the people who endured it. Beyond individual floods, we can also look at broader changes in water and land. The rivers of southern Mesopotamia have always wandered, splitting and rejoining, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones. Over the long term, coastlines have shifted as well. In the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, the head of the Persian Gulf lay further inland than it does today. Marshes expanded and contracted. Areas that were once estuary became dry enough for fields and towns. Elsewhere, low-lying lands were reclaimed by water. Sea level has not been static over human history, but in the time frames we are discussing for early Mesopotamian cities, the changes are measured in meters over millennia, not sudden walls of water sweeping over continents. Global sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, thousands of years before the first cities, certainly transformed coasts worldwide, but archaeology does not show evidence of a lost global civilization drowned overnight. This is important to say plainly. The flood stories we have do not require an erased advanced culture beneath the seas. Archaeology, with all its gaps and surprises, has found no trace of such a global, technologically sophisticated society ending in a single worldwide cataclysm. The world of the first Mesopotamian cities was remarkable, but it was built of mud brick, reeds and copper, not of vanished high technology. What archaeology can support is a more modest, and in some ways more human, picture of flood memory. Year after year, generation after generation, people living along the Tigris and Euphrates watched the waters rise and fall. Some years they rose gently and left fertile silt. Other years they came too high, too fast, tearing out banks, drowning fields, sweeping away houses. Over centuries, stories of particularly destructive floods would have been told and retold. Each new disaster could be measured against older ones. Not as bad as the one in my grandfather's time. Worse than any flood the elders remember. In such a context, it is easy to imagine how, eventually, memory might coalesce around the idea of a first, greatest deluge, a boundary flood that marked the end of an older order. As cities grew, as kingship became central to how people thought about history, that boundary could be framed in terms of rulers and dynasties. As theology developed, it could be framed in terms of justice, covenant, and cosmic reset. The tablets and scrolls that have reached us are the products of scribal thought, not seismographs. They compress many lives and many events into single, powerful narratives. They are not neutral weather reports. But that does not make them empty. When the Sumerian King List speaks of kings before the flood, when Atrahasis and Utnapishtim and Noah survive their respective deluges, these texts are witnessing to how ancient communities understood their place in time. They remember that the land was dangerous, that water could both give life and take it away. That order felt fragile and in need of explanation. Archaeology can tell us where people lived, how they built, what they ate, how their cities rose and fell. It can show us flood deposits, shifting shorelines, abandoned canals. It can sometimes date a destruction level closely enough to say something terrible happened here around this century. What it cannot do is stand up and declare, this is the flood of Atrahasis. This is the exact house where Utnapishtim loaded his animals. This is Noah's hill. The match between story and layer is always interpretive, always tentative. Texts, meanwhile, cannot give us precise water depths or sediment profiles. They give us patterns of meaning. They show us that ancient people felt a before and an after, that they drew a line through their remembered past and marked it with a flood. To hold both together, to let the soil speak of houses and rivers, and the tablet speak of kingship and covenant, is to accept a careful balance. We do not need archaeology to confirm every verse or every line for these stories to matter, and we do not need to turn myths into disguised engineering reports for them to carry memory. The first kings before the flood, in the Sumerian imagination, stand at the edge of what the spade can reach. Their cities have left traces in bricks and potsherds. Their world, as they themselves remembered it, has left traces in ink and clay. Between those two archives there is a space of uncertainty. It is in that space that later generations would keep returning to the old names, the old waters, and the question of why kingship and humanity itself had to begin again. For the people who wrote and copied these texts, the first kings were not just curiosities from an unreachable age. They were tools for thinking. By placing Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak on the far side of the flood, the King List is doing more than cataloguing names. It is saying something about where authority comes from, what it is for, and why it can fail. Kingship descends to the first city. It is not invented there, it is received. The city becomes the vessel, the place where a larger, invisible order touches ground. That gives early kings a double identity. They are ordinary humans living in brick houses and walking dusty streets. But they are also anchors for something that did not originate with them, a pattern of rule, of justice, of obligation between gods and people. When later scribes looked back across the flood boundary, they saw a past in which these patterns were simpler, clearer, closer to the divine will. By arranging the first cities in a calm sequence, by assigning each king a long measured reign, the text turns the remote past into a model. This is what order looks like when it is unbroken. One city at a time, one line of kings at a time, kingship moving in an orderly way from place to place. Then comes the flood, and everything stops. That interruption is frightening, but it is also useful. It gives the scribes a way to think about collapse. If kingship can be wiped away and then descend again, then even the worst disaster is not the end of the story. After destruction comes restoration. After a world is washed clean, a new city can receive the same gift, pick up the same duty, resume the same task of keeping the gods and the land in balance. This flood and restoration pattern is not just theology. It is a way of making sense of real cycles of loss and rebuilding. Droughts, invasions, failed harvests, dynasties that fall, these can all be folded into a story in which order is fragile but renewable. The King List's steady rhythm, city king years, creates a background music of continuity underneath the catastrophes. That rhythm may be why the text feels so strangely calm. Even when it mentions the flood, there is no panic in its voice. The scribes know that after the flood swept over, kingship will descend again somewhere. The chain is bent, not broken. Behind this, there's also a particular way of seeing the land. Eridu, Sippar, Shuruppak. These are not just dots on a map. In the King List and related traditions, they become what we might call sacred geography. Each city is a memory condensed into a place, a story about origins, about a god's special presence, about a moment when something began. To say kingship first descended to Eridu is to bind a whole cluster of ideas to a specific landscape. Marshes, canals, a temple mound rising out of flat country. To say Shuruppak was the city of the flood survivor is to attach the memory of almost ending and beginning again to a particular bend of river. Even if the exact temples crumbled, the names remained as coordinates in a mental map of meaning. When we read the King List now, it is easy to focus on the oddities, the impossible lifespans, the neat divisions of dynasties, the sudden appearance and disappearance of cities. But beneath those features lies something more familiar, a human need to feel that time, however broken, is still connected. The first kings still matter, not because we can verify their reigns, but because they show us how ancient people stitched their world together after rupture. They used long-ago rulers and half-remembered cities to say, there was an order before us, there will be an order after us, and we stand in that line even through disaster. As the tablets move toward their end, that line narrows into names. Names of kings, names of cities, names of floods survived and ages closed. The world that made those names is gone, its bricks worn back into dust and silt. Yet the sequence of rulers, the quiet repetition of cities receiving and losing kingship still speaks. In the final lines of the King List, and in the echoes it left in later traditions, the ancient impulse remains the same, to keep a few words alive that can carry memory across the waters. The tablet, resting in lamplight, holds those words still. The last work of the scribes is simple. They do not argue, they do not explain. They write the names that outlasted their world, and then they stop. Somewhere, Long after those last lines were pressed into wet clay, the cities themselves finally disappeared. The canals filled, the walls slumped, kilns went cold, and the rush of feet through gateways faded into the rustle of reeds and wind. But in the quiet, a few impressions of a reed stylus remained, a sequence of signs no thicker than a fingernail, holding a story that once stretched from before the flood to the known horizons of the scribe's own day. When we look at that tablet now, we're not just reading data from the past. We're entering a small, self-contained world that once lived entirely in someone's mind. Eridu at the marsh's edge, Bad-tibira with its imagined forges, Larak hiding in the gaps, Sippar beneath a clear sky, Shuruppak listening to the rising waters. All of that is compressed into a handful of names laid out in order, with reign lengths added like a slow, steady drumbeat of years. We do not know if those pre-flood kings really ruled, or if the cities in that phase of the story correspond to any particular archaeological layer. The texts themselves do not tell us. They give us fragments, a list here, a flood hero there, a god city, a remembered destruction. Later traditions pick up these fragments, reshape them, argue with them, set them into new patterns. Priests, poets, and storytellers debate what it all means, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just by telling the story a little differently. What survives is not a single, clean account, but a web of echoes. In that web, the pre-flood cities and their first kings occupy a special place. They stand just beyond verification, in a region of time that is part prehistory, part theology, part cultural memory. They are symbolic more than literal, and they are always incomplete, yet they are also persistent. They are the way several ancient cultures chose to think about origin, not as a blank, but as a world already ordered, already ruled, already capable of ending and starting again. Civilizations do this often. They tell stories of first days, last days, and second beginnings. There is comfort in it. If the universe has already passed through a flood, a fire, an age of darkness, then our own crises are not unique. They are another turn in a pattern that has room for collapse, but also for renewal. The clay tablet in the lamplight is a small, hard version of that hope. Its surface is fragile and chipped. Its script needs training to read. Its numbers do not fit our expectations. And yet, in a few quiet lines, it carries an entire imagined landscape of cities, rivers, gods, and kings. It carries a way of thinking about time that can hold both disaster and continuity in the same breath. When we listen to it carefully, we're not being asked to believe in 8 kings who ruled for hundreds of thousands of years. We're being invited to sit with people who lived 3,000 or 4,000 years ago and hear how they made sense of deep time, of floods, of power, of loss. We're asked to let a list of names become, for a moment, a bridge between worlds. If you've enjoyed resting in that calm mystery, letting these distant cities drift through your mind as you fall asleep or move through your own quiet time, you're welcome to stay connected. You can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and, if you'd like more journeys into the ancient world, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. I would also love to hear from you again. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. A late night in a city, an early morning before sunrise, a quiet afternoon somewhere far from these old rivers. Across all those places now as the names still remain. Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Simple marks on clay, carrying a memory of beginnings, endings, and beginnings again, across the long, slow flood of time.